Morning, everyone. So glad you're all here and rode buses all night like you've been congratulated on already. I did so many years of that myself. I commend you all. So I'll try to keep it brief and hopefully interesting. So you're aware that you're going to be facing this ballot initiative. It's going to be on your ballot for sure. And the group that's promoting it is essentially it's the group Compassionate Choices. And they're a very well-established and national group, and they're the same group that comes in state by state promoting essentially the same bill. And they're a national group, they're well-funded, and they have picked your state as a part of a strategic move. Basically, assisted suicide was legalized through a ballot initiative in the state of Washington and in Oregon. And there's a court case in the state of Montana which allows a doctor, should he be brought to trial, either in a homicide or a civil action, to claim consent as a defense. So while it's not explicitly legal in Montana, the other side will claim that there's 3 states it's legal, so that's what they're talking about. Washington and Oregon, Washington's ballot initiative was in 2008, and Oregon's has been in effect for about 14 years at this point. And the reason I mention them is because it's the exact same thing that's being promoted in your state. Basically, an adult, it's written in a way that says an adult with 6 months left to live, who is able to consent, can choose physician-assisted suicide. Now, I don't think I need to stand up here and explain to you the culture of life, the culture of death argument. I think you're all believers on this issue that assisted suicide is bad for your state, it's bad for our culture, it's bad in every way. But what I want to give you guys are a few tools to go back and convince you that this is bad law. And this is one of these issues, in the pro-life and the abortion issue, I think so often it's this constant changing hearts and minds, and it's often a long process of bringing people over. You guys are in a position, and I think this is an issue where you just need to cast doubt. Number one, you need to vote against this, and you need to tell everyone you know to vote against this initiative. Because Massachusetts is a very important state, which I'll come back to in a minute, about why it's so important that this is stopped in your state. And what you're charged with is go out and convince people not only to vote against it, just to cast doubt in their mind. And I think that there's some very simple ways you can do so, because this is just bad law. The law purports to have safeguards. And this is what the other side's going to tout. They're going to be, well, this is just going to be strict for the terminally ill, and there's all these great safeguards in place. And we have, not only are these safeguards very legally meaningless, which I'll get to in a second, they're very difficult to enforce, and they're pretty much an illusion. For one, they'll tell you that the person has to be of sound mind. But nowhere in the initiative, nowhere in the language is a psychiatric exam required. And we know through so many different scientific studies that people who have a will to commit suicide are typically suffering from a diagnosable mental illness. We can look backwards and look at about 94% of them were suffering from either depression or some sort of undiagnosed mental impairment. And the law does not require a psychiatric exam. So they're going to say, well, the person has to be competent. Basically, a doctor will sign off and say that there's no psychologist has to sign off and say the person was competent. Another thing that your Massachusetts initiative would do, and I think this one's really, really shocking, so I want you to pay attention. What they actually do is they will falsify the death certificate. So there's no way to go back in a year to look at, okay, these people died from physician-assisted suicide. Can we look and see that all the letter of the law was followed? You'll go back, it'll list cancer. It'll list the underlying condition. The doctors are literally instructed, and they do so in Oregon and Washington, to falsify the death certificate. So if that doesn't scare somebody, how are we going to find out if a doctor had done wrong, or if maybe somebody was suffering from dementia? Maybe there was an out-of-town relative who comes back and wants to get a lawsuit going against a doctor. I mean, how are we going to look back? We rely on the doctors to self-report, but there's essentially no penalty when they don't do it. And further, and I'm a lawyer here, so I don't want to get too technical, but the doctors are only going to be held to a good faith standard. Now what that means, when you're an accountant, or you're an attorney, or these sorts of things, you're held to a standard of practice of your peers, essentially. You have to, follow the same sort of requirements, and you have to put the sort of due diligence that, your counterparts in the profession would. And there's often rules set forth. You have to be licensed and things like that, so there's state rules, sometimes national rules about guidelines of practice. In Massachusetts, if this should become law, the doctor's only held to a good faith standard. That's shocking. You'd have to go into court to prove that they acted maliciously. You wouldn't have to just prove like, oh, well, they weren't really, they weren't sure if the person was of sound mind, and, they tried their best is all the doctor's basically held to. It makes it very, very tough to sue a doctor. And then I think something else that would be good to share with people, just sort of, I said, like these simple things. No psychiatric exam. They falsify the death certificate. And number 3, there's no witness at the time of death. Think about that for a second. What happens is there's supposed to be 2 different requests for the medication 15 days apart. I call it medication, the lethal prescription. The person is supposed to verbally ask for it or ask for it in writing, and then 15 days later they ask again, and then they can be handed it. At that point, we don't know what happens. There's some statistics kept in Oregon and Washington, and the bulk data is later destroyed, so we're not really sure. But what happens is the person will take the lethal prescription home, and we don't know what happens in that time. There's evidence that people have held on to that prescription for well over a year before using it. And so we know not only are people living longer than 6 months, but what happens in that year? If somebody is in an early stage of Alzheimer's and they get this lethal prescription and they go home, what happens? And I'm not, claiming that we have a lot of evidence of sort of sinister behavior, but when somebody is in the early stages of a condition known to lead to mental deterioration, they can request this prescription and then they go home with it. Now, we don't know what happens. You might have somebody that is extremely weary of the continued care for somebody who's very ill or difficult to manage. You just don't know what happens. And the state could have, gotten around this. Compassionate Choices deliberately doesn't want a witness at the time of death, and it's something that you could have easily required. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you a witness is going to fix this. This is bad. This is just a bad bill. It's bad for life. But this is something you could share with people, saying, no witness, no psychiatric exam. They falsify the death certificate. This is not good for Massachusetts. And moreover, some good news, your medical society came out very, very soundly against it. They reaffirmed their opposition to assisted suicide. And, a good argument there is that this really degrades the medical profession. And they believe that, and, so you can always point to the doctor groups. The doctors don't want to do it. They overwhelmingly reject it. Our medical association, our state medical association, overwhelmingly thinks this is bad for the profession. So, one more thing I want to share with you. I think this is another sort of compelling point, because we do have data in Oregon and Washington about sort of what's going on. Now, there are a couple of really good studies that were done. They were done by sort of an outside objective observer about why people are really choosing physician-assisted suicide in the Pacific Northwest. Why are they really choosing it? And quite frankly, I was shocked when I pulled this open. I expected to find that, the argument is that these people are in intractable pain, and that's, they feel like this is the only option they have left, and you sort of your mind goes to is there hospice? Is like pain management better? You look, they get you focused on pain, but not one person in Oregon and Washington asked for a lethal prescription because they were in current pain. That was shocking. A lot of them were fearful of future pain. That was a highly rated reason, but it wasn't that they were in current pain. There was a lot of reasons given, they were allowed to choose more than one in this survey. It's loss of autonomy, feeling that you've become a burden, the ability that you're not going to be doing the activities that you used to be able to do. These were the reasons that people were saying that they wanted to utilize the physician-assisted suicide. Something else that I think you guys can point to for your peers and for your friends, don't vote for this. In Oregon, we see the regular suicide rate has skyrocketed among all age groups. So when you see, there's 2 different groups here, just think about this for a second. Suicide prevention. We would do everything we could to prevent the suicide of teenagers, and there's entire organizations set up to prevent the suicide of certain groups, but the moment you become terminally ill, all of a sudden you're treated as a different group. You're somehow less than them. And so that's another thing you could point to, is that we've seen the general suicide rate go up in the states that have legalized it. Washington's a little newer, so we don't have good data there, but in Oregon, we've absolutely seen it skyrocket. It's gone up, let me get the right number, between 2000 and 2010, it went up 35%. It's 35% higher than the national average. And they were a state below the national average in that time period. All right, so I don't mean to be all doom and gloom, so there's some good news. The reason that I think Massachusetts is so important is that you guys are truly not only a medical center for the entire nation, the nation looks to your doctors and your hospitals, and what happens in Massachusetts has a very important ripple effect into the medical community and into the intellectual community as well. And you're very closely aligned in a lot of ways with the other states in New England, and when Massachusetts does something, then maybe we're in Connecticut and New Hampshire, and they, and especially we're in Vermont, and you see, they see, oh, look, what's going on in Massachusetts, it's not that big of a deal, not that many people are using it, and if it leaks into the rest of New England, we're in real trouble. And, it's relatively been confined out to the west coast, up in the Pacific Northwest, but if it should bleed into New England, we become very afraid that the scales tip. And that's extremely important for a reason here. The Supreme Court in 1997 unanimously ruled, it's an 8-0 decision, that there's no constitutional right to assisted suicide. And that was a great pro-life victory that I don't even know that I was aware of at the time, being a student still, and I'm not sure all of you would have even been aware, but there's no constitutional right to assisted suicide in the U.S. Constitution. However, we have some really two troubling things. There's a footnote in there where one of the Supreme Court justices says, well, if this under another cause of action showed up later, we might reconsider it. If there was different grounds for this case, we might reconsider it at a later point. And the Supreme Court, it's a 2005 child death penalty, minor death penalty, it's unrelated, but they have this very telling quote, something to the effect of, I won't get it totally right, it's not the number of states that's important, but it's the consistency and direction of the change. So if we see that it's, Washington, Oregon, there's this weird court case in Montana, if we also had Massachusetts, Vermont, and Connecticut, let's just say, legalize it, the Supreme Court might go back and look, the experiment in the states, we see that it's working, there's not a lot of, complaints against it, it seems to be going off without a hitch, and so they might reconsider a Supreme Court case. And that's extremely dangerous. So Massachusetts is truly a tipping point here. Compassionate choices, though, let me tell you, they have been nonstop for the last 2 decades. Over 100 legislative attempts, and I think about a dozen ballot initiative attempts at this point. And the fact that it's only legalized in these 2 states, I think this is good news. This is something that, it always comes down to be a really tight contest. But ultimately, this is something you could win. By casting doubt, by pointing to the flow, when you can't convince somebody that, the culture of life needs to be preserved in the medical profession and these sorts of things are important, I hope you could all point it along, though. Please just have doubts. This is bad law for Massachusetts. And let me reiterate, no witness, no psychiatric exam, they falsify death certificates, and the doctor's not held to the standard of regular medical care. So I really hope that you all go back and you're energized about this and you tell your family and friends and you get this ballot measure voted down. So good luck to you and thank you for being here.